Keanu Reeves had always found solace in quiet places. The world around him, filled with the constant noise of fame and expectations, often made him long for moments of peace and reflection. So when the opportunity arose for a road trip far from the chaotic press conferences and paparazzi, he seized it. The journey, though not for any particular reason other than to reconnect with himself, took him along the winding roads of small towns and scenic routes. It was a break from the usual, the Hollywood spotlight, the movie sets, the constant public eye. On a particularly long stretch of road, with the sun beginning to dip below the horizon, Keanu found himself in a small town, where the streets were quiet and the night was just beginning to settle in. His car hummed steadily as he drove through the familiar yet distant landscape. He wasn't in any rush, allowing himself to simply drive without a destination. But, as the miles stretched on, his fuel gauge began to drop. With no sign of a larger town on the horizon, he spotted a small, almost forgotten gas station on the side of the road. The station was old, the paint on the sign chipped and faded, and the overhead lights flickered as they cast a dull glow over the small parking lot. Keanu pulled in, the gravel crunching beneath his tires as he parked next to the lone pump. The gas station had the kind of weathered charm that made it feel like a place that hadn't changed in decades. Inside the station, the air was filled with the faint scent of gasoline and stale coffee, the only signs of life coming from a lone figure behind the counter. A woman, no older than her early 30s, stood there, her hands busy with the task of stocking shelves. The way she moved, slow and deliberate, suggested she had been on her feet for far too long. Keanu's eyes lingered on her for a moment, sensing something that didn't quite align with the usual bustle of a gas station worker. She seemed weary. Her face, though friendly, carried a shadow of exhaustion, and there was a certain tightness in her posture that spoke volumes. As Keanu walked into the station, he noticed her trying to smile at the few customers who walked by, her demeanor polite but distant, as though her mind was somewhere else. There was a weariness to her that seemed out of place for someone working in such a quiet, remote location. Keanu's curiosity piqued, and he made his way to the counter, where the woman glanced up at him, offering a polite, yet tired, smile. "Good evening," she greeted him, her voice soft but polite. Keanu returned the smile, his eyes studying her for a moment longer than most would. There was something in her expression, a mixture of fatigue and something more. Perhaps it was the weight of responsibility, or a deeper sense of struggle that Keanu could identify with. He had seen it before in people, in the way they tried to hide their hardships behind forced smiles. "Evening," he replied, his voice calm and steady. He handed her his payment for the gas, but he didn't move away immediately. Instead, he lingered for a moment, leaning slightly against the counter. "You've been here for a while, haven't you?" he asked gently, his tone not one of curiosity, but of concern. He had lived enough life to recognize when someone was pushing themselves too hard, when the toll of life was starting to show. The woman paused, as if surprised by the question, then offered a soft laugh that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Yeah, I guess you could say that. Been working here for a while now, just trying to get by." Her hands fidgeted with a pen on the counter, the rhythm of her movements betraying the tiredness that had crept into her every action. Keanu studied her for a moment. He knew that the phrase "trying to get by" was often more than just a simple statement. It was a subtle admission of struggle. People rarely spoke of their burdens so openly, but in her case, there was a certain honesty in her words. There was more to her story than she was letting on, and Keanu, with his own history of hardships, recognized that unspoken depth. "How long have you been working here?" he asked, his voice softening, almost as if he were asking about something more personal than a mere job. "A couple of years now," she answered, her eyes briefly flickering to the clock on the wall, as though marking the passage of time. She didn't meet his gaze, but the heaviness in her voice said more than words could express. Keanu could sense it, the invisible weight that she carried, the fatigue that went beyond physical exhaustion. "Must be hard," he said quietly, not out of pity, but genuine understanding. He had known struggles himself, loss, the pressure of constant expectations, and the quiet loneliness that sometimes accompanied a life in the public eye. There were many ways to feel isolated, even in a crowd, and Keanu had learned that life could be particularly unforgiving when it felt like no one was truly listening. The woman hesitated for a moment, then finally allowed herself to meet his gaze. "It's not so bad, just long days, and it gets hard to keep up sometimes." She smiled again, though it was a tired, fleeting expression. She shrugged lightly, as if brushing off the strain, but Keanu could tell she wasn't being entirely honest with herself. "Is there anything I can do for you?" Keanu asked, his words simple but filled with a sincere offer. It wasn't a grand gesture, but a genuine desire to help. He was used to people needing things from him, autographs, photos, or just a moment of attention. But this felt different. This wasn't about giving something that could be measured or easily understood. This was about acknowledging a shared moment of humanity. The woman paused, studying him for a moment. Her eyes flickered with a hint of hesitation, as though she weren't used to people offering help so freely. "I don't know," she said after a beat. "Just having a good conversation is probably more than I've had all day." Keanu smiled, the kindness in his eyes never faltering. "Then let's talk." And so, as the evening wore on, Keanu Reeves, the famous actor who could have been anywhere in the world, sat quietly at the counter of a small gas station in a quiet town. As Sarah spoke about her struggles, about her plans for the future, the burden of her pregnancy, and the loneliness that sometimes crept in, Keanu listened intently. He didn't offer advice or empty words. He simply listened, offering his quiet presence as a reminder that someone cared. And in that moment, amid the stillness of the evening, something unexpected began to shift. There was a connection, not of celebrity and fan, but of two people, brought together by the raw vulnerability of life's challenges. As Keanu sat quietly, listening intently to Sarah's words, the evening wore on in a way that felt almost timeless. The steady hum of the fluorescent lights above was the only sound that accompanied their conversation, aside from the occasional shuffle of her movements behind the counter. For a moment, the rest of the world outside, the noise of the highways, the rushing of time, the pressure of everyday life, seemed to disappear entirely. Here, in this small, dimly lit gas station, there was just a man and a woman, caught in the fragile dance of shared human connection. Sarah had begun to open up in ways that surprised even her. She hadn't expected much from the encounter, to be honest. Most of her days were spent in isolation, behind the counter, barely exchanging more than pleasantries with customers. Yet there was something about Keanu's calm presence that made her feel like she could breathe again, like the burden she carried was somehow lighter when she spoke of it. It wasn't so much the act of talking. It was the way he listened, really listened, as if her struggles weren't just fleeting moments, but parts of a much bigger, deeper story. She spoke of her pregnancy, how it hadn't been planned, but how, once she learned she was going to be a mother, something inside her had shifted. There was fear, of course, fear of being unprepared, of not being able to give her child the life she wanted. She described the weight of the decision to continue working at the gas station, despite the strain it put on her body. Sarah wasn't one to show weakness, and she certainly wasn't one to ask for help. But over the months, the exhaustion had begun to take its toll, creeping into her bones and wearing down her spirit. She spoke of long shifts, sometimes 12 hours or more, standing on her feet for hours on end, helping customers, cleaning the floors, restocking shelves. But the physical toll was only part of it. It was the mental exhaustion that was hardest to bear. The isolation, the loneliness of being away from her family, away from anyone who could understand her situation. She had always prided herself on being independent, on not needing anyone's help. But now, as her pregnancy reached its later stages, she could feel the weight of that independence dragging her down. She was tired in ways she couldn't fully explain, tired not just of the work, but of the pressure to be strong, to hold it all together. Her relationship with the father of her child had fallen apart long ago, leaving her to navigate this new chapter of her life on her own. She had no close family nearby, no support system to lean on. So she worked, day after day, pushing herself harder than she should, because she didn't know any other way. She couldn't afford to be weak, couldn't afford to show the cracks that were beginning to appear. "I'm just trying to keep my head above water," Sarah said, her voice wavering slightly. She didn't look at Keanu as she spoke, instead focusing on the counter in front of her, as though she were speaking to herself, to the world around them. "I don't know what else to do. I don't have anyone to help me. I feel like I'm barely making it through the day. And then I wake up and have to do it all over again." Keanu didn't say anything at first, just allowed the words to hang in the air, filling the space between them. He could sense the weight of her struggle, the quiet desperation in her voice. He could also hear the pride beneath it all, the pride that kept her from asking for help, from admitting how much she was truly hurting. He knew that feeling all too well. The fear of being seen as weak, the fear of letting others in, of relying on someone else when life felt like it was unraveling. Keanu understood that more deeply than most, but it wasn't something he was going to say aloud. He wasn't here to offer advice. He wasn't here to fix anything. He was here to listen. And sometimes that was enough. "I think sometimes we push ourselves so hard that we forget to breathe," Keanu finally said, his voice quiet but grounded. "I know what it's like to feel like you're carrying the world on your shoulders, like you have to keep moving forward no matter what. But there's a cost to that, isn't there?" Sarah nodded slowly, her eyes fixed on the counter, tracing the edges of a small crack in the wood. "Yeah," she whispered, "there's a cost." Keanu sat in silence for a moment, thinking about his own life. The years of loss, the periods of isolation, the moments when he, too, had felt like he was carrying too much weight. He had learned that there was no shame in needing help, in being vulnerable. It was something he had come to understand through his own trials and tribulations. But he also knew that everyone came to that realization in their own time. Some people needed to discover it for themselves, just as Sarah needed to find her own way. "Do you ever let yourself take a break?" he asked, the question simple, but carrying a quiet urgency. "Do you ever allow yourself to just stop for a while?" Sarah's shoulders tensed, and for a brief moment, the defensiveness that had been a part of her for so long came rushing to the surface. She opened her mouth as if to offer an excuse, a reason why she couldn't, why she didn't deserve rest. But something about Keanu's tone, his steady gaze, made her stop herself. She closed her eyes for a moment, took a deep breath, and then let out a soft sigh. "I don't know how to stop," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know how to just take a break. I've been running on empty for so long that I don't even remember what it feels like to rest." Keanu nodded slowly, understanding the weight of her words. "You don't have to carry everything on your own, you know," he said, his voice calm but firm. "It's okay to ask for help. It's okay to let people in. You don't have to do it all by yourself." For a moment, there was silence again, but this time, it wasn't heavy with exhaustion or shame. It was a quieter kind of silence, one that held the possibility of change. Sarah looked up at him then, her eyes filled with a mixture of surprise and vulnerability. She had never been one to ask for help, never one to lean on anyone. And yet, in that moment, she realized that maybe it wasn't such a bad thing to let someone else in. "I don't know," she said softly. "I don't know if I'm ready for that." Keanu smiled gently, his eyes warm and understanding. "That's okay. You don't have to be ready yet. But just know that when you are, you don't have to face this alone." In the quiet that followed, Sarah allowed herself a small, hesitant smile. It was a moment of vulnerability, one she hadn't allowed herself in a long time. For the first time in ages, she felt like maybe, just maybe, there was hope. Hope that she could let go of some of the weight she had been carrying for so long. Hope that there was someone out there who would be willing to help her when she needed it most. And as Keanu quietly finished his coffee and prepared to leave, he could see the flicker of that hope in her eyes. It was a small thing, but it was enough. Enough to spark a shift, to remind her that kindness and empathy could make a difference, even in the darkest of times. The evening lingered on as the sun dipped further beneath the horizon, casting a golden glow across the small gas station and the quiet road beyond. Keanu felt a shift in the air, a subtle, almost imperceptible change that seemed to hang between him and Sarah. The words they had exchanged had carried a weight, not just of shared experience, but of something deeper, an unspoken acknowledgement of the humanity they both carried. Keanu could sense that Sarah, for all her bravado, was beginning to crumble under the strain. There was a tenderness to her now, a vulnerability she hadn't shown before. It wasn't pity that he saw in her eyes, but a quiet understanding, as if the guard she had so carefully constructed was beginning to soften, piece by piece. But despite the connection they had started to build, Keanu knew that words alone wouldn't ease the burden Sarah carried. She had spoken of the exhaustion, of how her body seemed to rebel against her every movement. Her legs ached, her back throbbed, and the weight of her pregnancy was a constant reminder of the challenges ahead. And yet, she never let on how much it truly hurt. Sarah was the kind of person who wore her struggles like a badge of honor, hiding the pain behind a mask of self-sufficiency. She had always believed that if she could just push through, if she could keep moving forward, things would get better. But as the days blurred together, she had started to question that belief. Keanu had seen that look before, the look of someone who had pushed themselves so far that they no longer knew how to stop. He could relate to it more than she would ever know. He knew what it was like to keep going even when you felt like you were running on empty. The world could be a cold, isolating place, and sometimes it felt like the only way to survive was to put your head down and keep going, no matter the cost. But Keanu had learned the hard way that this kind of relentless self-sacrifice only led to burnout, to a breaking point where you were left with nothing but exhaustion and regret. As he stood there, silently observing Sarah, an idea began to form in his mind. He couldn't change everything for her, not in one conversation, not in one evening. But there was something small, something tangible, that he could offer her, something that might make a difference. He looked down at his watch, then back at Sarah, who had resumed her work behind the counter. She was still trying to put on a brave face, still acting like everything was fine, even as her movements slowed with every passing minute. Keanu took a slow, deliberate breath, then walked over to the counter, gently setting his empty coffee cup down beside her. She glanced up, giving him a small, tired smile. "Anything else I can get you?" she asked, her voice polite, though there was an undertone of exhaustion in her tone. Keanu smiled in return, but his expression was different this time. There was no rush, no urgency in his manner. He leaned slightly forward, his gaze steady but kind. "How about this?" he said softly. "You've been on your feet for hours now, and I can see how hard you're pushing yourself. Why don't you take a break? Just a short one. Go sit down for a few minutes, stretch your legs, and have a bite to eat. It'll give you a chance to breathe. I'll handle things here." Sarah blinked, a brief flash of surprise crossing her face. She opened her mouth to protest, as though she was about to say something along the lines of "I'm fine," or "I can't leave this place." But Keanu raised a hand before she could speak. His tone was gentle but firm. "I'll keep an eye on things," he reassured her. "You deserve a moment to rest. Trust me, it'll make a difference." Sarah hesitated for a moment, her eyes flickering between Keanu and the empty stretch of counter in front of her. She had never been one to accept help, never been one to put herself first. She had always felt that others had more important needs than her own. But there was something in Keanu's eyes, something that told her that it was okay to let go for a moment, to allow herself the space to simply be. It wasn't a weakness to take a break. It was a reminder that she was human, and even the strongest people needed to rest. With a small sigh, Sarah finally nodded, her shoulders loosening slightly as she made her way toward the small break room in the back of the station. Keanu watched her go, feeling a quiet sense of satisfaction wash over him. It wasn't much, but it was something. Sometimes, the smallest gestures could have the biggest impact. In a world where people were often too busy or too proud to ask for help, offering a moment of kindness could shift everything. Keanu stood behind the counter, his hands tucked into his pockets as he glanced out the small window at the darkening sky. The soft glow of the gas station lights seemed to amplify the stillness of the night. He didn't know what the next steps for Sarah were, what her future held, or how she would navigate the challenges ahead. But for the first time that evening, he felt a glimmer of hope that things might be different for her. Just a small shift, a subtle change in perspective, could alter the course of someone's life. As Sarah returned a few minutes later, her shoulders more relaxed and her expression less burdened, Keanu gave her a reassuring smile. She had taken that brief moment to herself, and it had made a difference. The exhaustion in her eyes had lessened, if only by a fraction, and that alone was enough to show her that she didn't have to do everything alone. She could take small breaks, find ways to recharge, and accept help when it was offered without feeling like she was losing control. "Feel better?" Keanu asked softly, his tone kind. Sarah gave him a small smile, her eyes grateful but still wary. "Yeah, I do actually. I didn't realize how much I needed that." She paused, and for the first time, her voice held a note of vulnerability. "I don't know what's wrong with me. I've always been so independent, so used to doing everything myself. But it feels different, letting someone else step in for a minute." Keanu chuckled quietly, his voice warm. "There's nothing wrong with that. In fact, it's probably one of the hardest things to do. We're all wired to want to handle things on our own, but sometimes letting someone help you is the strongest thing you can do. You don't have to carry everything on your own." Sarah studied him for a moment, as if weighing his words carefully. There was something in his demeanor, something unspoken, that made her feel like she wasn't alone anymore. It wasn't just the help he had offered. It was the way he had shown up without expecting anything in return, the quiet reassurance that she didn't have to be perfect, that it was okay to take a moment for herself. For the first time in a long while, Sarah felt the pressure she had carried for so long start to ease, even if just for a brief moment. And that moment, she knew, was enough. It was a start. The following days came and went with a strange sense of quiet rhythm, and although the world outside seemed to rush by in a blur, Sarah began to notice subtle changes in herself. Each evening, as the sun set behind the horizon, she found herself more attuned to the small moments of peace she had once dismissed as insignificant. She had begun to allow herself small breaks, short pauses in the flow of the endless hours she spent behind the counter at the gas station. She'd take a few minutes to sit, breathe, and stretch her legs. Nothing major, but it was enough to create space for herself, something she hadn't realized she needed until it was gently suggested. It wasn't just the physical rest that made a difference, though. It was the idea that she didn't have to shoulder everything alone. That simple, quiet gesture from Keanu, that offer to watch over the counter so she could take a moment for herself, had sparked a shift in her perspective. It reminded her that asking for help didn't make her weak, and it didn't make her any less capable. Instead, it made her human, just like everyone else. She wasn't a machine. She didn't have to be perfect. In the moments when she allowed herself to let go of the pressure, to let herself be vulnerable, she found clarity in the spaces between the demands of her everyday life. Keanu had been a catalyst for that shift, and though their time together at the gas station had been brief, the impact of their conversation lingered in her mind. She had thought of him often in the days that followed, wondering about the kind of man he was, why he had taken the time to speak with her, to listen so intently, when so many others might have simply moved on. The brief exchange had been more than just casual kindness. It had felt like a reminder of something she had forgotten, of the importance of compassion, of connection, of being seen for who you truly were, without the walls we so often put up to protect ourselves. The following Friday evening, just as the twilight sky began to darken, Keanu appeared at the gas station again. Sarah hadn't expected him, hadn't even realized how much she had come to appreciate his visits, small as they were, until she saw him walking toward the entrance. She was standing behind the counter, glancing over the empty shelves, when the door chimed open. And there he was, stepping inside like he belonged. His presence, calm and steady, felt like a steady anchor in the whirlwind of her routine. "Hey," Keanu greeted with that easy smile that made Sarah's heart lift despite herself. "How's it going tonight?" Sarah smiled back, the warmth in her expression real, though there was still a layer of hesitation she couldn't entirely shake. She wasn't used to letting people in, especially not strangers, especially not people who made her feel like maybe she wasn't as alone as she thought. But she was trying. And Keanu, for whatever reason, made that effort feel less daunting. "It's good," she replied, though her voice betrayed the tiredness she still felt from the long shifts. "Busy, like usual. Same old thing." Keanu nodded, stepping up to the counter and glancing around the station. He looked more relaxed this time, as if the weariness that sometimes haunted him had eased, even if just for a moment. He glanced down at the display of snacks and sodas, then back at Sarah. "I see you're still pushing through," he said, his tone light, but with a hint of concern. "How's everything going? You've been taking care of yourself, right?" The question caught Sarah off guard, and for a second, she felt herself freeze. She wasn't used to people asking about her well-being in such a genuine way. People came to the gas station, paid for their fuel, and left. They didn't linger, didn't wonder how she was holding up. The vulnerability that bubbled up at that moment made her shift uncomfortably behind the counter, even as she tried to push it aside. "I'm fine," she said, offering a smile that she hoped didn't seem too forced. "Just doing what I have to do. You know how it is." Keanu's expression didn't change, but there was a quiet understanding in his eyes. He didn't push her to say more, but he didn't drop the subject either. Instead, he leaned forward slightly, lowering his voice just enough that it felt intimate, like a shared secret between them. "You know, Sarah," he said, his gaze never wavering from hers. "You don't have to do it all on your own. I know it's hard to ask for help, especially when you've been used to doing everything yourself. But you don't have to carry it all. Not all the time." The words hung in the air between them, and for a moment, Sarah could only stare at him, her mind grappling with the truth in his statement. She hadn't realized how tightly she had been holding onto everything, how the weight of it all was slowly crushing her. She had convinced herself that if she just kept pushing, if she just kept pretending that everything was fine, she would make it through. But here, now, in this quiet corner of her world, with Keanu's words echoing in her mind, she began to wonder if it was time to let go of the illusion of control. "I know," Sarah replied softly, her voice quieter than usual. "It's just hard to let go. I'm not used to asking for help." Keanu nodded, as though he understood completely. "It's hard for all of us, I think. But the truth is, Sarah, it's okay to lean on others. It doesn't make you weak. It makes you strong in a way you might not realize. You're human, just like everyone else. We all need each other." His words resonated deeply with her, not because they were new, but because they were something she had forgotten, something she had pushed away for so long. She had been so focused on survival, so locked in a battle against the world, that she had forgotten what it felt like to allow others to step in and share the load. She had forgotten what it felt like to just breathe, without the weight of the world pressing down on her chest. "You're right," Sarah said, almost to herself, as the reality of his words began to settle in. "I've been so focused on getting by that I forgot what it feels like to just take a step back and ask for help. I don't know why it's so hard." Keanu smiled softly, the warmth in his eyes never faltering. "It's not easy, but it's worth it. You don't have to do everything alone. We're all connected. We all need someone." For the first time in a long while, Sarah felt a sense of clarity. She didn't have to have all the answers. She didn't have to carry everything on her shoulders, trying to be everything to everyone. It was okay to be tired, to be human, to ask for help when she needed it. And maybe, just maybe, it was time to open up to the idea of letting others in. As Keanu continued his conversation with her, offering light-hearted distractions and gentle encouragement, Sarah found herself listening in a way she hadn't before. She wasn't just hearing the words. She was absorbing them, letting them take root in her heart. Maybe, just maybe, she could start letting go of the weight she had been carrying for so long. And in that moment, as the evening wore on, and the world outside remained oblivious to the quiet transformation unfolding inside that small gas station, Sarah felt the first flicker of hope, a hope that, with time, she might find her way back to herself. The days grew cooler as autumn settled in, and Sarah found herself shifting in her perspective more often than she had ever imagined. It wasn't a sudden transformation, but a gradual softening of the hard edges that had surrounded her heart for so long. The endless hours at the gas station, once a place of monotony and isolation, had begun to feel different. With each passing day, she allowed herself to embrace small moments of quiet, moments of rest, moments of connection. And those moments, though small in the grand scheme of things, had started to add up, gently nudging her toward something better. Keanu's visits had become a kind of anchor for her, a quiet reassurance in the midst of her otherwise hectic life. It wasn't that he was offering grand solutions or sweeping changes, but the simplicity of his presence, the ease with which he made her feel seen, had a subtle power. He never pressured her to open up more than she was ready for, never made her feel like she was obligated to reveal the parts of herself she kept hidden. Instead, he met her where she was, offering quiet words of encouragement and support. And more than that, he showed her that it was okay to let go of the perfection she had clung to for so long. Sarah still found herself working long shifts at the gas station, her body aching with the strain, but she had started to prioritize the moments of rest, the small acts of kindness, the fleeting pauses where she could just breathe. Sometimes, Keanu would arrive in the late afternoon, when the sky was painted in hues of orange and pink, and he'd stay for a while, chatting with her about everything and nothing, about his own experiences, his thoughts on life, the movies he'd been watching, the books he'd read. And in those moments, Sarah could feel herself relaxing, her worries fading into the background as they exchanged stories and laughter. It wasn't just the time spent together that made a difference. It was the way Keanu's presence had given her permission to be vulnerable. He never judged her for the weight she carried, for the uncertainty she often felt. Instead, he offered a space where it was okay to not have all the answers, where it was okay to struggle, and where it was okay to not be perfect. Sarah had spent so much of her life hiding behind walls, pretending that everything was fine. But Keanu had shown her, through his actions and his words, that it was okay to step outside of those walls, to share the parts of herself she had been afraid to acknowledge. One evening, as the leaves outside began to turn shades of deep red and amber, Sarah found herself sitting on the small bench outside the station, taking in the crisp evening air. The sun had just dipped below the horizon, leaving behind a sky that was painted in soft purples and blues. The station was quiet, the only sound the occasional hum of passing cars on the nearby road. It was one of those rare moments of stillness, the kind that felt like a breath after holding it in for too long. As she sat there, Keanu pulled into the parking lot, his car humming softly as he parked near the pumps. He stepped out, his usual easygoing smile lighting up his face as he made his way over to her. For a brief moment, Sarah considered returning inside, going back to the grind, but something about his presence made her want to stay, to embrace the calmness of the moment just a little longer. "Mind if I join you?" Keanu asked, his voice light but warm. Sarah smiled, gesturing to the empty space beside her. "Of course. It's nice out here tonight." Keanu sat down beside her, his gaze lifting to the sky, as he took in the soft colors of the evening. They sat in comfortable silence for a few moments, both of them lost in the peaceful quiet of the world around them. The weight of the day, the pressure of her responsibilities, seemed to melt away in the stillness of the night, and for the first time in a long time, Sarah felt the overwhelming noise inside her head quiet down. "You know," Keanu said after a while, breaking the silence in his usual gentle way, "sometimes we forget how important it is to just be still. We're so focused on moving forward, on accomplishing things, that we forget the power of taking a step back and just breathing." Sarah nodded, her gaze still fixed on the horizon. "Yeah, I've been learning that lately. I used to think I had to do everything myself, that if I just kept going, kept pushing through, I'd eventually get to where I needed to be. But now I realize that it's okay to slow down, to let others in, to take the time to rest." Keanu glanced at her, his eyes soft but full of understanding. "It's a hard lesson to learn, but it's one of the most important ones. You don't have to carry it all on your own, Sarah. There's strength in knowing when to step back and take care of yourself. The world can wait for a little while." The words hung in the air, and for a brief moment, Sarah felt like she was being seen in a way she hadn't been before. She wasn't just the woman working tirelessly behind the counter. She wasn't just the pregnant woman struggling to keep it all together. She was a person with her own needs, her own hopes, her own fears. And in that moment, surrounded by the calmness of the evening and the quiet understanding of Keanu, she realized that it was okay to have those things. It was okay to feel uncertain, to feel tired, to feel human. Keanu's voice broke through her thoughts once more, this time lighter, as if he were trying to shift the mood. "You know, I've been thinking, maybe one of these days we should take a day off together. Just get away from all of this. Do something that doesn't involve gas stations or the constant rush of life. What do you think?" The idea felt both foreign and freeing. A day off, a break from the constant demands of her job, the never-ending pressure to keep going. Sarah felt a flicker of excitement, something she hadn't felt in a long time. She had always thought of herself as someone who didn't deserve a break, who didn't have the luxury of slowing down. But now, the idea of just being, of doing something for herself, felt like an adventure waiting to unfold. "I think I'd like that," she replied, a smile tugging at the corners of her mouth. "Maybe we could take a day and just see where the day takes us. No pressure, no deadlines." Keanu's smile widened, and for a brief moment, Sarah caught a glimpse of the kindness that radiated from him. It was the kind of kindness that didn't expect anything in return, the kind that didn't demand perfection, but simply offered a hand, a listening ear, and a chance to be more than the sum of your struggles. And in that quiet exchange, as the stars began to twinkle in the sky above them, Sarah realized that it wasn't about the grand gestures or the sweeping changes. It was about the small, quiet moments of connection, the moments when someone saw you for who you truly were, not for the image you tried to project. Keanu had given her that, and in doing so, he had shown her that sometimes it was okay to let go of the weight you've been carrying. It was okay to rest. It was okay to take a step back and just breathe. For the first time in a long time, Sarah felt like she was finally giving herself permission to do just that. To rest, to breathe, to simply be. The weather grew colder as winter approached, and Sarah found herself once again swept up in the whirlwind of work and obligations. The gas station remained a constant, the late-night shifts growing longer as the world outside seemed to bustle with its own brand of urgency. People came and went, each with their own stories, their own lives to navigate, but as Sarah stood behind the counter, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was changing in her, a quiet, steady transformation that she wasn't entirely sure how to define yet. The lessons that Keanu had unwittingly imparted to her lingered in the back of her mind, often resurfacing during the quiet moments when she found herself alone. They were gentle reminders to slow down, to be kind to herself, to embrace the small breaks she had once dismissed as insignificant. But life, as it often did, didn't make it easy. The demands of her job, the pressure of her growing responsibilities, the physical and emotional strain. It all came crashing in like an unrelenting wave. Even though she had started to allow herself small moments of rest, even though she had begun to understand the value of taking a step back, the world seemed determined to test that newfound sense of peace. There were days when the weight of it all seemed too much to bear, when the exhaustion was so deep that it felt like it would consume her. It was one such evening, late into the night, when Sarah found herself sitting behind the counter, her eyes heavy with fatigue, when Keanu appeared again. The station was quiet, the air thick with the cold bite of winter. The lights flickered softly, casting long shadows across the aisles of snacks and drinks, and Sarah felt an odd sense of relief wash over her as she saw him walk through the door. There was something about his presence that had always calmed her, a grounding effect that she didn't quite understand but deeply appreciated. "Hey there," Keanu said, his voice warm and familiar, and Sarah smiled as she looked up from the counter. "Hey, Keanu, what's up?" Keanu shrugged lightly, as though the answer didn't matter as much as the question itself. "Just passing through," he said, his eyes scanning the station before landing on her. "You've been holding up all right." It was a question Sarah had grown accustomed to, and yet it always felt different when Keanu asked it. There was no judgment, no expectation. He wasn't asking to pry, but because he genuinely cared, something that Sarah had become more aware of with each passing visit. The honesty in his eyes made her want to be just as open with him, even if it was just for a moment. "I'm getting by," Sarah replied, trying to keep her voice light. Same old, same old. You know how it is." Keanu raised an eyebrow, a soft smile playing at the corners of his lips. "I know it's not always easy, but you've been doing a lot of good here, Sarah. It's not just about getting by. It's about finding the moments in between. The moments where you can breathe, where you can pause." Sarah hesitated. His words, simple as they were, cut through the walls she had so carefully built around herself. The truth in them stirred something within her, a truth she had been reluctant to admit. She had spent so much of her life pushing forward, focusing on the end goal, that she had forgotten how to appreciate the journey itself, the small steps, the quiet moments of grace along the way. "Sometimes I don't even know how to pause," she admitted, her voice softer now, laced with a vulnerability she wasn't used to showing. "Everything just feels like it's moving so fast. Like if I stop for even a second, I'll fall behind." Keanu nodded slowly, as if he understood exactly what she meant. It's easy to get caught up in the rush, to feel like you're always chasing something. But here's the thing, Sarah. You're not meant to be in a constant race. You're meant to live. And living means taking the time to be present, to allow yourself the moments of stillness, even when it feels like the world is pulling you in every direction. The words hung in the air between them, and for the first time in a long while, Sarah felt the weight of her own thoughts begin to lift. She had always believed that to survive, she had to keep moving, keep pushing, keep going. But what Keanu was telling her felt like an invitation to step outside of that mentality, to let go of the notion that survival meant enduring at all costs. She could breathe, she could rest, she could be. "I don't know how to do that yet," Sarah said, a wry smile tugging at the corner of her lips. "I've spent so much time just surviving that I've forgotten what it feels like to truly live." Keanu leaned against the counter, his gaze steady but kind. "You're not alone in that. I think we all go through phases where we get so caught up in the grind, in just making it through, that we forget why we started in the first place. But the beauty is, you can always come back to yourself. You can always find your way back to what really matters." Sarah nodded slowly, his words settling in her chest like a quiet promise. "It's just hard, you know. There are days when I feel like I'm doing okay, like I'm making progress, and then there are days when it feels like everything is falling apart. It's like 2 steps forward, 1 step back." Keanu's expression softened, and for a moment, Sarah could see the weight of his own experiences reflected in his eyes. That's the thing about life, he said quietly. It's not about moving in a straight line. It's about the dance, the ebb and flow, the ups and downs. There's no such thing as perfect progress. Just keep showing up. Keep giving yourself grace. It's all part of the journey. For a long while, Sarah simply stood there, her mind processing his words, her heart beginning to soften in a way it hadn't in years. She had spent so much of her life trying to control every aspect, trying to keep everything perfectly aligned. But the truth Keanu was sharing with her was that life didn't work that way. Life wasn't linear. It wasn't about getting everything right all the time. It was about showing up, even when things didn't go as planned. It was about giving yourself the freedom to make mistakes, to stumble, to fall, and to get back up again. You make it sound easy, Sarah said, a small laugh escaping her lips, though it was tinged with something more. But I guess it's a lot harder than it seems. Keanu grinned, that same gentle smile lighting up his face. It's not easy. But it's worth it. You've already started the journey, Sarah. You're already on your way. There was something about his words that made Sarah feel like she wasn't as alone as she had once believed. That maybe, just maybe, she didn't have to carry everything by herself. There were people in her life who cared, who saw her, who wanted to help her rediscover the pieces of herself she had hidden away. And for the first time in what felt like ages, Sarah allowed herself to believe that it was okay to let others in, to lean on them when the burden became too much. I guess it's about trust, isn't it? Sarah mused aloud, more to herself than to him. Trusting that I don't have to do it all alone. That I can accept help, that I can be vulnerable. Keanu nodded, his eyes meeting hers with a depth that made her feel understood in a way few people ever had. Exactly. And trust that you're enough, just as you are. You don't have to be perfect. You just have to be real. That's where the magic happens. As they stood there, talking quietly about everything and nothing, Sarah realized that she was beginning to understand the things that had once felt out of reach. The simplicity of kindness, the beauty of vulnerability, the quiet power of accepting help. It wasn't a sudden epiphany, but rather a series of small, shifting moments that had begun to reshape her heart. She still had a long way to go, but for the first time in years, Sarah felt like she was on the right path. A path where she could breathe, where she could rest, where she could be fully present in the life she was building. And that, in itself, was a victory worth celebrating. Winter had begun to take its grip on the world outside, a sharp chill in the air, and Sarah felt the weight of it settling deep into her bones. It wasn't just the cold, though. The pressure of the world around her had started to feel like an invisible weight that bore down on her chest. The gas station, once a place of steady routine, had become a backdrop to her exhaustion. Every day seemed like a blur, the same faces passing by, the same tasks to complete, and the same quiet longing for something more. Despite the small moments of relief she had found, the underlying exhaustion was hard to shake. There was a part of her that felt like she was stuck in an endless cycle, constantly pushing forward, but never quite feeling like she was getting ahead. One evening, as the sky outside darkened and the first few flakes of snow began to fall, Sarah was cleaning the counters, her mind lost in a haze of thoughts. She had just finished wiping down the shelves when she looked up to see a familiar figure entering the station. It was Keanu, his usual calm presence bringing a flicker of warmth to the otherwise cold evening. He walked in, his coat dusted with snow, and his smile immediately brought a sense of peace that she hadn't realized she needed until that moment. "Evening, Sarah," he said, his voice carrying the same quiet warmth it always did. "How's it going tonight?" Sarah paused for a moment, considering his question. How was she doing? She wasn't sure anymore. She was tired, so tired that it felt like even the simplest task had become a mountain to climb. She was still doing what needed to be done, but there was a hollow feeling that lingered beneath the surface, a sense of being disconnected from herself and everything around her. "It's all right," she replied with a half-hearted smile, not quite able to hide the exhaustion that lingered in her voice. "You know, just Getting through it. Keanu nodded as he approached the counter, his eyes kind and understanding. I hear that. But it doesn't have to be all about just getting through it. There's more to life than just surviving the days. Sometimes, you've got to take a step back and really live them. Sarah gave a soft laugh, though it was tinged with weariness. I've been trying, Keanu. But it's hard to do that when you're constantly running from one thing to the next. Some days, I just don't know how to slow down. Keanu leaned against the counter, his gaze thoughtful as he watched her. You don't have to do it all at once. It's the little things that count, Sarah. The quiet moments. The breaths in between the chaos. Those are the things that keep you grounded. His words, simple as they were, resonated with her in a way she hadn't expected. It wasn't the first time he had said something like that. But this time, something in his tone made her listen more intently. She had spent so much of her life focused on what she was doing, on what needed to be done, that she had forgotten how to just be. It wasn't about achieving some grand, perfect version of life. It was about finding peace in the ordinary moments, in the small acts of kindness, in the simple joy of breathing. I don't know if I've ever really let myself breathe, she confessed, her voice quieter now. I've always been so focused on the next thing, on the next task, that I forget to stop and just appreciate where I am right now. Keanu smiled softly, his eyes full of understanding. It's easy to do that. But the thing is, Sarah, when you don't take the time to breathe, when you don't take those moments to pause, you miss out on the beauty of what's happening around you. You miss out on the people who are there for you. You miss out on the moments that are meant to be savored. The word hung in the air, and for a moment, Sarah felt a shift within herself. She had been so consumed with the idea of keeping up with everything, of staying ahead, that she had neglected the present moment. She had missed out on the beauty that existed in the spaces between the work, the tasks, and the expectations. It wasn't about abandoning her responsibilities, but about finding balance, about allowing herself to experience life fully, even in the midst of the struggle. Sometimes, I feel like I'm drowning in everything, Sarah admitted, her voice trembling slightly as she spoke. Like I'm just holding my breath, waiting for the next wave to hit. It's hard to know how to stop swimming long enough to catch my breath. Keanu's expression softened, and for a moment, he said nothing. He simply reached out, his hand resting lightly on the counter between them, a silent gesture of support. There was a comfort in his presence, a steady calm that made Sarah feel like she wasn't as alone as she sometimes thought. You're not drowning, Sarah, he said quietly, his voice gentle but firm. You're not alone. You're doing the best you can, and that's enough. Sometimes, it's okay to just float for a while. Let the current carry you instead of trying to fight it all the time. Sarah looked up at him, her heart swelling with a mixture of gratitude and vulnerability. She had always felt like she had to fight, had to push through the pain and the struggle in order to survive. But Keanu's words were a reminder that it was okay to let go, to stop fighting so hard, and to allow herself to rest. I've been so afraid of stopping, Sarah admitted, her voice barely above a whisper, afraid that if I stop for even a second, everything will fall apart, that I'll lose control. Keanu's gaze never wavered, and there was a quiet strength in his eyes as he spoke. Control is an illusion, Sarah. You can't control everything. All you can do is take it one step at a time. And when you need to rest, you rest. When you need to breathe, you breathe. The world will keep moving, but that doesn't mean you have to chase it. His words were simple, but they carried a weight that Sarah felt deep within herself. She had spent so much of her life focused on what she couldn't control, on trying to make everything fit into some perfect, manageable plan. But life, as Keanu had shown her, wasn't about perfection. It was about living, about finding peace in the imperfections, about accepting that not everything could be fixed or solved immediately. Sarah took a deep breath, the cool air filling her lungs as she let it out slowly. For the first time in a long time, she allowed herself to simply be, to stop fighting against the current, and to accept the present moment for what it was. She wasn't perfect. She didn't have it all figured out, but that was okay. "Thank you, Keanu," she said softly, her voice filled with a quiet sense of gratitude, "for always reminding me to breathe." Keanu smiled, his eyes warm and reassuring. "It's my pleasure, Sarah. You deserve to take those moments for yourself. You deserve to breathe." As they stood there together, the soft hum of the gas station filling the quiet between them, Sarah realized that she didn't have to carry everything on her own. She didn't have to have all the answers, and she didn't have to be everything for everyone. She could give herself the gift of slowing down, of resting, of breathing. And in doing so, she would allow herself to truly live. The snow continued to fall outside, blanketing the world in a soft, quiet stillness. And in that moment, Sarah felt a quiet peace settle over her, one that had eluded her for far too long. It wasn't about having everything figured out. It was about accepting where she was, finding beauty in the small moments, and knowing that she didn't have to do it alone. The journey ahead would still have its struggles, but now, with a deep breath, Sarah knew she had the strength to face whatever came next. The days following that conversation with Keanu were marked by a subtle but powerful shift in Sarah. It wasn't dramatic, no overnight transformation, but more like a quiet awakening that crept into her every action. The rhythm of her life, once dominated by the rush of tasks and obligations, began to slow just enough for her to notice the small joys that had always been there, waiting for her to see them. She started taking moments for herself, short breaks during her shifts, to look out the window at the snow-covered streets, the sound of the wind whipping through the trees, and the gentle hum of the station's lights. It wasn't much, but it was enough. Keanu's words lingered in her mind, and with each passing day, she found herself more willing to embrace the idea that life didn't have to be a constant race. The small, seemingly insignificant moments held more power than she had ever realized. She began taking the time to breathe, not just physically but emotionally. She allowed herself to feel what she needed to feel, without judgment or shame, and in doing so, the weight she had been carrying for so long seemed to lift, even if just a little. She started to notice how kind people were to her, how the small acts of compassion from strangers and regular customers made her feel a connection to something larger than herself. One late afternoon, as Sarah finished her shift and prepared to leave, she found herself standing outside the station, gazing out at the world beyond. The sky had begun to turn a soft pink as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a golden glow on the blanket of snow that covered the ground. It was a beautiful sight, one she might have overlooked in the past. But today she took it in fully. The quiet beauty, the peaceful stillness, and the sense that, for once, she was exactly where she was meant to be. The crisp air hit her face, and for the first time in weeks, she felt a sense of clarity. The uncertainty, the pressure she had been carrying, it was still there, but it no longer consumed her. She realized, as she stood there in the cold, that life wasn't about perfection. It was about finding peace in the chaos, about allowing herself the grace to move forward without expecting to have everything figured out at once. She didn't have to be anyone other than herself. She didn't have to push so hard. It was okay to take breaks, to rest, to breathe. As Sarah walked toward her car, her phone buzzed in her pocket. She pulled it out, expecting a message from a friend or family member, but instead, it was a text from Keanu. A simple message, yet it carried so much weight. "Just wanted to check in and see how you're doing. Remember to take care of yourself. You've got this." She smiled to herself, the warmth of his words wrapping around her like a blanket. It wasn't just the message that mattered. It was the fact that he had reached out, that he cared enough to remind her of something she had often forgotten. That small act of kindness, that simple reminder to slow down and take care of herself, was like a lifeline. She wasn't alone in this. She wasn't meant to carry the burden by herself. And that realization, that feeling of being supported, lifted her in a way she hadn't known she needed. The drive home that evening was quiet, and as Sarah navigated the familiar streets, she couldn't help but think about how far she had come. It wasn't just the changes in her routine or the way she had started to embrace the simple moments in her day. It was deeper than that. It was an internal shift, a change in how she saw herself, and more importantly, how she saw her place in the world. She no longer felt like she had to be everything to everyone. She no longer felt like she had to fight to be seen or heard. She was enough, just as she was. That night, as Sarah settled into bed, she closed her eyes and took a deep breath. She let it out slowly, feeling the tension in her body ease. She was learning how to rest, how to let go, how to trust herself. She didn't have all the answers, and she didn't need to. Life wasn't about figuring it all out at once. It was about taking the journey, one step at a time, and trusting that, even in the midst of uncertainty, there was beauty to be found. The next morning, Sarah woke up early, as she always did, but this time, there was something different about her approach to the day. Instead of rushing through her morning routine, she took a moment to pause. She made her coffee slowly, savoring the warmth of the mug in her hands. She stood by the window, looking out at the stillness of the world as the first light of dawn touched the snow. It was a new beginning, not just for the day, but for her. She was learning to live fully, to embrace each moment as it came, and to trust that everything would unfold as it was meant to. At the gas station that day, Sarah felt a renewed sense of purpose. She greeted customers with a new warmth in her voice, a kindness that she hadn't fully tapped into before. The work, though still challenging, no longer felt like a burden. It felt like a part of her story, a part of the journey that was shaping her into who she was meant to be. She didn't have to be perfect. She just had to show up, be present, and take things as they came. And in the midst of that, she found that the world had a way of meeting her halfway. The people who passed through the station were kinder, more patient, and more open to the small moments of connection that Sarah had started to cultivate. She had become a mirror of the kindness and grace she had begun to give herself. In her vulnerability, she had discovered a strength she didn't know she possessed. Later that week, as Sarah was closing up the station for the night, she received a call from her mother. The conversation was brief, but as they talked about the usual family matters, Sarah couldn't help but notice how much more present she felt. She was no longer distracted or distant in her thoughts. She was there, fully engaged, listening with intention. For the first time in a long time, she felt the deep connection to her family that had often eluded her during her busiest moments. That evening, after the call ended, Sarah sat down on her couch, feeling a deep sense of peace. She thought about everything she had learned, the lessons of kindness, the importance of slowing down, the strength in vulnerability. She thought about Keanu and how, in his simple way, he had shown her the power of just being. She didn't have to be anyone other than herself. She didn't have to have all the answers. She just had to trust that, in time, everything would fall into place. And in that quiet moment, Sarah realized that the journey she had been on was far from over. There would be challenges ahead. There would be days when she would struggle, but now she knew she had the tools to face them. She could breathe, she could rest, and most importantly, she could live. Not just survive. Live. She leaned back on the couch, the weight of her journey finally feeling light. For the first time in a long time, she felt ready to take the next step, knowing that no matter what came her way, she was never truly alone.